This is a part one of a two-part training, and we're going to be talking tonight about sort of the core of BARC's work in the forest to monitor proposed logging projects on federally managed land. And for those of you that I haven't met, my name is Michael Krakta, and I'm BARC's Forest Watch Coordinator. And I've been with the organization involved with the organization since 2011. And Groundtruthing it's how I first got involved, and it's continues to be one of the things I really look forward to the most throughout the year. It's a really fulfilling and impactful activity, and so I'm excited to see that folks are here and interested in learning about it. And I think at that I'm going to turn it over to Misha to introduce themselves and give us any housekeeping items that we need to consider.
Hi everyone, my name is Misha. I work as BARC's Forest Watch Assistant and have been working with BARC for about almost a year. I'm really excited to have a second season of Groundtruthing, so I'm excited that you all are here. A couple of housekeeping Zoom items. There's going to be a few times when y'all can participate if you'd like. So during those times, you can go ahead and type in the chat and we can read it out. Or if you'd like to unmute, you can type stack like this in the chat, and that will be a key. We can call on you to unmute. We're going to save most of the Q&A until the end of the presentation, but if you have any immediate clarifying questions, please go ahead and type those in the chat. You can also type other questions that maybe you want at the end of the Q&A in the chat, and we can read those out at the end. Otherwise, please remember to keep yourself muted if you're not speaking so that we can keep everything moving. Thanks.
Great. So yeah, for those of you that have been to BARC events recently, you know that we always start things off with our historical accountability and land acknowledgement practice. And this is sort of a partially read, part interactive and part internal. But it's something that we have a formalized practice for and really honor the language as it's written here. So I know this is kind of a wordy slide, but this is here in case folks would like to follow along. And so I'm going to go ahead and read this part here. So again, this is our historical accountability statement here. As an organization founded by white people in the lineage of settler colonial environmentalism, BARC understands that conservation work, quote unquote, is embedded in the white supremacist legacy of colonization, land theft, cultural erasure, and genocide, and the systemic use of law to suppress native sovereignty over their homelands. We understand that BARC's dedication to protecting the stolen lands, referred to now as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest, carries with it this paradox which continues to be ignored by most conservation groups and which continues to harm Indigenous people today. In our advocacy and policy work, BARC's interactions with federal agencies often comply with the authority assumed by the US government. This quote unquote authority was assumed through the legalized displacement and genocide of Indigenous people and cultures, including through the legislative creation of public lands. These crimes and injustices have not been reconciled or rectified. Today, all non-Native people have the privilege of primary access to these public lands as a direct result of this strategy of legalized supremacy. BARC recognizes that conservation organizations like ours are complicitly participating in the ongoing displacement of Native people and culture each time settlers and non-Indigenous people claim the benefits of access to this land, and by engaging the paradox of protecting stolen land. We are working to change the vision, mission, and strategies of our organization. BARC affirms that these are the rightful homelands of the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Tonino, Wasco, Wishram, Paiute, and many other Native people who lived here and who have always lived here and have always belonged to and cared for this land, and whose bold resistance to colonial oppression should guide us all. And so now I want to respectfully invite any Native people here today to have a few minutes to speak freely if you would like to. So we're going to move on now to our land acknowledgement practice. BARC is committing to the work necessary to repair relationships between settler descendants and Indigenous people, and between all non-Indigenous people and the land. And the land acknowledgement is just the necessary first step in this revolutionary cultural work. We ask our community to practice humility, respect, and apology with us by personally dedicating your time, energy, action, and resources to support the people who rightfully belong to this land. So if you've practiced this acknowledgement with BARC before, please get out the notebook that you use for this practice. And if this is your first practice, I encourage you to get something to write with. And so we're going to take the next 2 to 3 minutes just to write some instructions, intentions, and actions, and next steps for yourself, outlining how you will be developing your practice of acknowledgement through action. And if you've been at a recent BARC event, you should have your writings from past events so you can revisit what you've set out for yourself to do and how you've made your intentions concrete. So yeah, please do take this time to reflect on your efforts and update your intention and action plan. And so we'll give this a couple of minutes here. Okay. So if people are ready, just kind of finish up that thought that you started. So we want to ask folks now to set aside your journal and turn your attention away from yourself and join us in a respectful moment of silence in contemplation and humility in honor of the original people here tonight across the continent in the past, present, and the future. All right, thank you all for supporting this important practice and learning. It's really important that you continue this practice acknowledgement through action in all areas of your life. Thanks so much.
Okay, so welcome to Groundtruthing 101. Thanks, Michael, for doing that land acknowledgement, and thanks everyone for participating. One thing I forgot to mention was that this is going to be recorded and it's being streamed to Facebook, but only the host's videos are shown. All right, and on to the training. So this is part one of a two-part training. We usually do these trainings in person and they're pretty hands-on, but our goal with this virtual training is to give you a lot of the background context about what ground truthing is and how and why we do it. And then when you come to your first couple field days, you'll be paired with either Michael, myself, or a volunteer that has a lot of experience ground truthing, and you'll get more of that like hands-on mini training while we're out ground truthing. And then if you all haven't signed up for part two is on Saturday. I'm putting that in the chat. Yes. So this is a photo from the Grasshopper timber sale, which is one of the projects that will be ground truthing this field season. This is a ground truther named Jordana who's measuring a tree that is so big, our measuring tape can't reach around it. All right, next slide. Oh, cool. In today's training, we're going to talk about the context of where and why we ground truth, about timber sales and how we use NEPA, or the National Environmental Protections Act, to interact with the Forest Service, common issues we find, and how to get to a unit and read a Forest Service map. On Saturday, we're going to be going more in depth into what ground truthing looks like, what we're looking for, and why.
Okay, so just a little bit of context before we get started with kind of getting into the weeds here. So BARC works mostly within what is now Mount Hood National Forest. Those of you that have been there, you know it's about 50 miles east of us here, or the mountain rather is. The National Forest actually is an area about 1 million acres which surrounds Mount Hood. And it's managed by the U.S. Forest Service, which is under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And a lot of people that I've talked to throughout the years think that Mount Hood is fully protected, kind of like a national park. But national forests are actually a lot different than national parks in that, national parks, they're managed actually under the Department of the Interior, and mostly for, preservation and recreation and, protecting ecosystems, while national forests actually have this multiple use mandate, which includes resource extraction as part of that. And we actually have a whole training on the policies that govern national forests and kind of the history of all that our staff attorney Brenna Bell gives. And so I really encourage folks to check that out. I think we might have a recording of it posted up on our YouTube channel. If not now, we are going to have that up there soon. So you can see here, this is a map of Oregon. It's a little bit outdated, but it shows all of the public quote unquote land in our state. And the areas in dark green, those are wilderness areas within national forests. And that pink area around Crater Lake, that's actually the only national park in our state. And so other than Crater Lake and those wilderness areas, none of this other area is actually fully protected from logging. Those are the only places there. So I will say, again, since the federal government manages this forest using public money, we often call it public land. But it's also really important, again, to remember that this land did become public through the removal of indigenous people before the national forest system was ever established. And, putting parts of this land into protection meant, for example, that practices of promoting first foods through the use of fire was prohibited, among a whole lot of other things that were traditionally practiced on this land. And, even the establishment of wilderness areas as these kind of untrampled, human-free environments really kind of negated the fact that people had been on this landscape for a really long time. And If folks are interested in how national forest lands interact with tribal treaties, there's lots of information out there, including this interactive map, which you can kind of click around and link different parts of national forests to the specific treaties that were signed in those areas. And it lists all the tribes who are present at the time or not present. There's also a whole presentation that we're giving about this. I think it's on April 22nd. That is an upcoming event that's on our website that really digs into kind of the indigenous history of public lands in Oregon. So encourage folks to check that out. Outside these wilderness areas, one thing that really continues to determine each national forest budget is the amount of timber that they can sell through what's called a timber sale. And how this works is, the Forest Service identifies where they'd like to log to meet their timber target that they receive from Washington, D.C. each year. So they identify those areas. They then release an environmental analysis with a public comment period, which is kind of where BARC and the public comes in. And, if that project is then approved, it's then a decision is signed and it's auctioned off and leased to a private timber company who then logs the trees. And this is all done under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And this is a law that was passed back in the 1970s, which requires federal agencies to do three things: take a really hard look at and disclose the potential impacts of their projects through an environmental analysis. So the hard look and the disclosure, that's number one. Number two, and then number three is respond to the public's concerns about that, about any impacts that they might see or any information that the agencies might not have readily available. So it also kind of requires that dialogue as well. And that plays a really integral part in the work that BARC does and has always done. And over to you, Misha.
Okay, so the act of ground truthing is walking the areas of the forest that the Forest Service has proposed to be part of a timber sale. And then we use what we all find as a foundation for our BARC stances and messaging on proposed projects. If you look at the map on the right, you see all these little pink polygons, and those polygons represent areas that the Forest Service has proposed for logging, and they break up those areas into units. So each one of those little shapes is called a unit. So this is one of those times where participation, you can go ahead and put an answer in the chat or type stack in the chat if you'd like to unmute. Our question is, what are some of the reasons why we do this and why do we think it's important? Diane says to stop logging. Ryan, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Sure, maybe one reason is that if we're not double checking the Forest Service and the logging companies, they may not do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the fact that we're out there on the ground watching, it's like both a preemptive and an afterwards double checking to make sure that the Forest Service and the logging companies are following the law. Morgan says, verify that the age of timber in the space is what the U.S. Forest Service says. Jennifer says to hold the USFS accountable and make sure they are telling the truth about the areas proposed for logging. Ultimately, it is to stop or at least minimize the logging project. Yes. To verify the information the USFS states about each unit is true. Yes. Protecting habitats. Yes, definitely. To add weight to arguments against logging. Yeah. We're out there like backing it up with what we find. Melissa says to bring attention to the practice, be a public advocate. Yeah. Yeah, we get photos out there, we get a lot of information that we collect, and we can use that to educate people about what's happening on Forest Service land. Jennifer says to collect evidence in case we need to litigate. Yep, Courtney says to protect watersheds, definitely. Riparian areas are a place that, riparian areas being wet places with rivers and water moving through them are really important and a place that we focus on a lot. All right, I'm gonna give it 15 more seconds. Awesome. To connect with the land ourselves. Yes, that was the one thing I was gonna say. Perfect. And also, yeah. Awesome, okay. So to speak up for those that can't speak for themselves. Yep. Okay, next slide. Awesome, those are all great reasons. That's exactly why we do all this. Okay, so this map on the left shows theoretically all of the projects on Mount Hood National Forest that would be happening right now, either being logged or being planned. This isn't what it actually looks like because of the fires disrupted a lot of things, but had there not been the fires, this is how much of the land would have been involved in timber sales. So as you can see, there is a huge part of the forest that is involved in timber sales, and the Forest Service doesn't always have the time or the motivation to look at all these areas in as much detail as we would like. So that's why we get on the land or get on the ground. Part of what determines the amount of timber sales in each national forest are timber targets set by each administration. The timber targets under Trump and Obama administrations both increase the timber targets, but they've recently decreased on Mount Hood National Forest, so that's great for all of us. One thing to note about these timber sales is that the Forest Service doesn't usually call them a timber sale, but they might be called like a restoration project. The photo on the right, if you go up a slide or back, Michael. Yeah, the photo on the right is a photo from the Crystal Clear Restoration Project, and that was proposed as a fires and fuels reduction project, and you see that a lot in all of the areas that are yellow on the map on the east side of the mountain. All right, next slide, yeah. So a lot of the projects are thinning projects, and thinning isn't necessarily what you think of when you hear the word thinning. It's usually pretty intense and can involve thousands of acres of deforestation that occurs when they are having gaps, roads, and landings. The thinning can be really aggressive, and almost every project includes something that's called regeneration harvest or shelter wood, which can equate to a clear cut on the ground. So you can see on the right here's a road. You can see a gap, I think, on the left. Cool. So like Michael mentioned before, these projects are planned under NEPA, which requires the Forest Service to take a hard look at potential impacts, transparently disclose impacts, and respond to public comment. These pictures might give you a little bit of a clue, but this is another chance for participation. So the question is, what do you all think are some examples of issues we might find by walking timber sales or things we might care about in the forest? All right, Darlene says cutting large trees, best carbon storage. Alex says sensitive endangered species inhabiting the unit. Bill says potential for fire. Snags important to wildlife. Habitat of certain species where the USFS claims there are none. The question is, what do folks think are some examples of issues we might find by walking timber sales or things that we might care about out in the forest? I said that kind of quickly again, so if you need another, I'll post it in the chat actually. Developing old growth characteristics, diversity and complexity. Small waterways, yeah. It's definitely like lots of small streams that aren't shown on the Forest Service maps. Old growth trees, creeks or incline. Awesome, these are all great. Landslide risk, definitely. Okay, we'll give another like 15 seconds. Roads not on the map. Yeah, anything that's not on the map. Healthy watersheds. Awesome. And then just so you all know, I'm going to keep track of your questions and put it on a list so we can get to it at the end. There's old growth that is important to leave intact for retrieval habitat. Yeah, so signs of endangered species or protected species that might drop parts of the timber sale. Awesome. So as you can see on this slide, here's a lot of examples of what ground truthing might look like. We have somebody measuring slope in the top right corner. We have people identifying wild sign, measuring trees, finding old big trees, endangered species, and let's see, somebody measuring canopy closure. So we're going to go into more detail about what ground truthing involves Saturday, but this is a little bit of a glimpse.
Great. And so before we get out into the forest and kind of starting at the beginning of, you know, the process of getting involved in tracking timber sales, anyone out there can sign up for updates on timber sales on the National Forest. When you go to the Mount Hood National Forest website, in the projects page, you can see the URL up here. But if you just Google Mount Hood National Forest, you'll be able to navigate there pretty quickly. If you go to projects, you can look at what's called a schedule of proposed actions. If you can see my cursor here, or it's oftentimes called a SOPA. And what that is, it's a list that's going to tell you what projects are being planned and when the estimated public comment periods for those projects are going to be. And there's usually in that a link to the associated planning documents, including maps and environmental analyses and whatnot, if they've been released already. And each of those projects also has contacts that you can get in touch with if you have questions about those projects or want to make sure that you are kept in the loop when the comment periods happen. Starting pretty recently, you can also sign up for these email updates using this new Gov delivery system that was just introduced about a month ago, and that kind of takes you through this process of, you know, clicking on boxes and identifying which types of projects that you're interested in getting updates about and where. So definitely encourage people to check that out. And when you sign up for those updates, the first thing that you're going to receive about a proposed timber sale is a scoping letter. And what this is, it's usually a very brief document with very little information, but it always includes, you know, just a statement that the Forest Service is proposing a project in a particular place. Talks about the where, talks about generally the why, you know, any rationale that the Forest Service might have for that project is usually included in this in some brief form. And it usually comes with some kind of map to, you know, let you know generally what area it's in and kind of what some of the surrounding forest there is and the road system and how to get there and whatnot, which we'll talk more about. So something that we usually do when we do in-person ground truthing trainings is we break out into groups with some of these scoping letters and kind of have a little bit of a discussion about what's in them. So we're going to do things a little bit differently tonight. And I have here a few statements from the scoping letter for, this was, let's see, for the Zigzag integrated project, the Zigzag timber sale that was proposed up off of Highway 26. So, you know, these scoping letters, they can often make some pretty bold statements about what the conditions are on the ground. And so, you know, that can really lead to some really important questions that we want to be considering and internalize before we're getting out into the forest and taking a look around. So I took some sections out of the scoping letter from this project for us to just sort of read and start thinking about what questions we have. And I guess also more specifically, kind of how those questions might be answered by actually getting out on the ground and taking a look at the forest that they're proposing these activities in. So I'm just going to read these two statements, and then I think maybe what we'll want to do is sort of similarly open things up, and I'll provide a prompt after I read these. How about that? So first quote here: there are many stands in the project area that are overcrowded and relatively uniform. A primary purpose of this project is to improve the health and increase diversity of forested stands. So that's statement number one. Statement number two is the desired condition in reserves is a multi-layer canopy with large diameter trees, a well-developed understory, more than one age class, and sufficient quantities of snags and down woody debris. So there's kind of a lot there. I think the prompt for this is, what do folks think about, once we get out on the ground, what are some things that we really want to be kind of honing in on when we're out there? Like what questions do these statements kind of bring up to folks that we might be able to answer by getting out into a timber sale? Is the prompt here. Also with that, if there's anything in these statements that people are really confused about, you can also just go ahead and ask away in the chat as well, or put yourself on stack.
All right, Diane said, what is actually there? Maybe there are already various sized trees.
Right, so yeah, that's in response to this statement about the, that it's very uniform.
Courtney says, can check diversity in canopies present.
Mm-hmm.
Alex says, for statement one, does the statement accurately represent what is present in the stand? Nathan says, document size range of trees and how to define overcrowding. Yes, how do you define overcrowding? That's great.
Yeah,
that's a great question.
So that's another thing I'll say about, this scoping period, this kind of initial period in the public process regarding these timber sales is, scoping is the time that you're not really going to have all the answers. It's not really that time to jump in and provide the Forest Service with tons and tons of information. But it is a really, really good time to ask questions. And it's actually the best time to ask those kinds of questions. Like in the scoping letter, the Forest Service mentions overcrowding. How is that defined? The Forest Service should be making that very clear in subsequent analyses that they produce for this area, how they're defining overcrowding and sort of what their desired future condition is compared to what's there now. So yeah, great question.
Okay, Darlene asked, aside from wilderness areas, are there complex forest reserves in Mount Hood National Forest?
Yeah, so there are. The Mount Hood National Forest management plan, it includes, I won't get too deeply into this right now, but it includes a whole suite of land allocations that have various degrees of protection attached to them. And so there's something called a riparian reserve, for example, where activities need to have a really, really clear and strong rationale for any management to occur there, and it has to they have to tie it to benefits to aquatic species. There's a few other ones that are like that, but I think maybe we can talk a little bit more about that either at the end or maybe on Saturday.
Well, yeah, I'm flagging that we can talk or to bring it up at the end if we have more time. Okay, some other answers. Is there already a multi-canopy or multi-layer canopy? Are there significant quantities of snags? What's the definition of many? Brian says might be uniform stand of older, larger trees with fewer having fallen or died yet, stage before multi-layer canopy. Yeah, Is logging going to create the desired conditions? Is their plan going to create the desired conditions? What is a sufficient quantity of snags and down woody debris? What is the condition of the understory of the forest? Assessing whether their stated need for the treatment, in quotes, is legitimate, and what dynamics are in play that create current conditions.
Wow, these are great questions. I'm really happy to see you also engage with this one. We're going to do one more here, or I guess a couple more statements, which are a little bit different, just to give you an idea of some of the other rationale that's sometimes included in these. This is from the same scoping letter. So due to past fires and management practices, large trees and down wood are lacking adjacent to some project area streams. There's an opportunity to take actions to enhance riparian habitat by thinning where appropriate and by falling and leaving some trees in riparian areas. So, that sounds pretty good, right? Second one here, the desired condition is to have a landscape accessed by an appropriate network of roads that provide for management access and visitor safety while minimizing risk to aquatic resources. So, this project sounds pretty great, right? That's one thing about reading these things is, before actually getting out into the forest, like I've read scoping letters before where I'm like, yeah, on a surface level, this rationale and these actions sound pretty great. But just real quick here before we move on, what questions do folks have for these statements that maybe are a little bit different than those first two? Maybe just take a couple minutes here.
What new road construction is proposed?
Yeah, what's that appropriate network of roads? What does that look like? How is that defined?
Does thinning enhance riparian habitat? What evidence maybe are they using to say define enhances riparian habitat? What scientific data do you have that suggests that riparian areas would benefit from thinning trees? What methods and negative impact will there be to achieve these goals? Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, it sounds like you all are really on the right track here. These are some great questions and ideas. I think we're going to move on here to the next slide, unless there's, maybe give it a couple more seconds here.
How will runoff from road construction and thinning impact riparian areas?
Mm-hmm.
Why is a network of roads necessary for management? What management, needs the roads?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll be talking about roads a lot on Saturday, but it is a very important part of all of this that, there's an existing road system that is out there now that's oversized. It was mostly constructed to access the forest for the initial logging that occurred, back in the day, and it continues to have really lasting impacts on the forest now. And the Forest Service is very stubborn about that road system and keeping as many roads out there as they can oftentimes so they can continue to have that access. And where they can't use that road to access the forest that they want to, they oftentimes will include quote unquote temporary road building to access units. And we see projects sometimes where they're proposing up to 20 miles of temporary road building, which is, it's kind of a misnomer because once you build a road out there, they're always going to have that alignment and that template to build that road again whenever they want. So the impacts of that road building they're lasting. There's nothing really temporary about it.
So, I'm seeing these questions and I'm just letting you know that I'm flagging them for the end.
Great.
Okay.
Move on.
Awesome. All right, so timber sales can be pretty large, and the scoping letter will often oversimplify the conditions that exist over these areas. So, Michael, if you go back a slide. Yeah. And then, so this is a map that was given by the Forest Service and is associated with a scoping letter for the Crystal Clear Restoration Project, or Crystal Clear Timber Sale. You can see that this is broken up just into red and blue, which represents dry or moist forests. And this was over 13,000 acres. So just having two classifications really oversimplifies what these forests are and how they'll respond to logging, which is part of the reason why we get on the ground. Go to the next slide. So this is an example of what you all picked up on with the desired future conditions. So a lot of the times when the Forest Service proposes a project, they'll include what desired future conditions that they say they need to log in order to get. So this was a part of the Crystal Clear Timber Sale. On the left is the Forest Service's examples of the desired future conditions, and on the right are pictures that BARC took and included in the comments for this timber sale. As you can see, they're almost identical, and it's hard to imagine how logging would create the difference between right and left. All right, this is another example of how the planning documents really don't reflect reality. This is a picture taken from the Wacoma timber sale. Up in the right is a little section of a map that was included with scoping. And this map reflects the stand age, or the average tree age of each of the units. And this picture was taken right about where Michael's mouse is. And if you look over to the right on this key, you can see that the green, it's green to red, and green represents the younger stand ages. And to me, it looks like they're saying this unit should be in the 30 to 50 year range. And if you look at these trees, these are so clearly not 30 to 50-year-old trees. It's clearly like much older than what they're reporting. Okay, so now we'll talk about how to get to a timber sale. So we know it's in Mountain National Forest because we're in Mountain National Forest. The first step to narrowing down where it is to ask which district it's in. So there are 4 districts in Mount Hood National Forest. You can see in like the southwest is the Clackamas River Ranger District. In the west is the Zigzag Ranger District. In the northeast, north and northeast, is the Hood River Ranger District, and in the far east is the Barlow Ranger District. Each of these staff have different budgets, different staff. Each of these districts have different staff, different budgets, and different priorities. So knowing which district it is in is the first clue to where it is and what the project might be like.
Okay, so next step, we know this is in the Clackamas River Ranger District right here. And the next thing we see is this kind of this weird row of letters and numbers right here that's kind of running across the top of this document here. And so what this is referred to as the Township and Range. And this is a really, really old system of land surveying that broke up public lands into these 1 square mile chunks and references them by their distance to a reference point, what's called a principal point. And you can see when you open up a Forest Service map, you can see these same kinds of letters and numbers kind of running along the edges of those maps. And this is important to understand because this can often be the first step in knowing kind of what general area your project is in. Within the district once you get that far. And so with this system, land was divided into these 6 by 6 mile, what are called townships, which are then divided into these 36 1 square mile sections here, which if we go back here, you can actually see these on these maps. I'm sure everyone has has seen these in the past and maybe, I don't know, just don't notice it or don't know what it is, so you move on. But that's kind of what that is. And so the values of how east or west an area is from this reference point is called the range. And the value north to south is called the township, hence the R and T here. And so, for example, T2 south, township 2 south, and range 2 west, it looks like. That's right here. And so that's basically means that this area is between 6 and 12 miles west and south of Washington Park, which, yeah, I forgot to mention this principal point. If you go up to Washington Park, you can actually find this plaque on the ground that is the reference point for this whole entire system in this region. And so this is definitely something, again, over Zoom, it's a little wonky to explain, but it's something that gets a whole lot easier with practice, and I'm sure folks will get the hang of it more once we are able to try this out in person. Oh, here's just another slide kind of breaking this out in another way. You can go even deeper into each section and really get specific, and sometimes the maps or sometimes the scoping letters get that specific, but it's not very often that they do talk about the northeast corner of section 14 or something like that. So these are the different paper maps that we often use. We usually start out with the Mount Hood National Forest map. This is for the entire forest. It's usually like around $10 or something like that. We provide all these maps for folks when you come out and volunteer with us, so you don't have to like worry about going out and buying one, but they are kind of nice to have. And if you want to get into a little bit more detail, this is one of the district maps. This one's for the Barlow district. You can kind of see this area of the forest map here all shaded in. That's the Barlow district. Those are cheaper. Those are usually under $10, and they have more detail, like more streams, more roads. They show the topography, and yeah, and they're super cheap. And so you can beat them up and draw all over them and fold them up wrong, and it's okay. Over to you, Misha.
Okay, so once you get an idea of the general area of the timber sale, you can look, this is an example of a unit map to get a more specific idea of how to get exactly to the timber sale and to each unit. And you can see each of these units are numbered so that you can reference them. You can go to the next slide. So this is another example of a unit map. And these black and white lines are all roads. And in order to know how to get to a unit, you're going to need to learn how to read the Forest Service road system. You can see on this map that there's 7 digits for each of the roads. So yeah, like right there, you see 4613000, 4613150 is a road that is going off of it. So there's 3 different types of roads that you're going to see on recreation maps and on signs in the woods. There are main roads. Those are usually paved, and you can think like Highway 26 or Highway 35 are main roads. Through the Clackamas, if you've been there, is Road 46 that goes off of the 224. Those are all main roads. Then off of the main roads are collector roads, and those can be paved or unpaved. And then off of the collector roads are spur roads, and those are usually unpaved. Those are usually the roads that are going to be the least maintained and the most bumpy. So the main roads always have 2 numbers and then are followed by 5 zeros. So in this example, we have 2400000. Those are usually just represented by the first 2 numbers. So yeah, on signs and on maps. Then the roads that come off of those are the collector roads, and they will have the first two numbers of the main road that they're coming off of, and then two unique numbers after that. So they'll have four numbers. It's 2490, but the full name is 2490000. But on maps and road signs, a lot of the times you'll just see those four numbers. And then the spur roads have the first four numbers of whatever collector road they're going off of, and then three unique numbers. But a lot of the times, those roads are just represented by the last three numbers. So for all of these roads, but especially the spur roads, you want to make sure that you include, like when you're making notations about this, when you're ground truthing, that you include all 7 numbers, because 914 can represent a bunch of different spur roads. Yeah, so let's look as an example. So this 4610, yeah, if you point, to the 4610150, that's a good example. And then if we go back over to that first road that you were pointing to, yeah, we have right off of here is 4613150. So these roads are super close together. So we could think that you may be coming across either of them if you just wrote 150. Are there any clarifying questions about that? Because that can be particularly confusing. We also have a little guide that we will send, and this is a great thing to practice when you're out there and get a sense of when you're actually out navigating too. On a ground truthing field day is something we can talk about. Okay. So once you figure out the roads, you get to the general area. I need to find my notes. Okay, so now you want to get to the actual unit, and navigating to the actual unit can be kind of tricky. It's good to write out directions beforehand and look at the map and look at different features that you might want to look at to see what do I see to know that I'm getting close to the unit? What do I see to know that I'm in the unit? And what do I see to know that I've gone too far past the unit? So some things that you can pay attention to are bends in the road, mileage, the number of spur roads that are coming off, creek crossings. And then whenever you're making notes of that too, think about, well, maybe the spur road's really old and I might not see it, or maybe the creek is dried up because it's August. So you want to think about all those things before you're getting out there. Once you get to the unit, you're going to be walking off trail for the majority of the time you'll be out. It's good to cover as much of the unit as you can, but we want to prioritize walking safely and slowly and enjoying yourself and soaking up as much as you can in the unit. So once you get to a unit, we usually take some time to think about how we're going to approach the unit. So let's say I was looking over at unit 352. The pink one up at the top.
Where is that? Sorry. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I was going to this unit, I might be, I'm driving there and I'll know I'm there when I see the spur road. And what do I want to see in the unit? Well, I want to see if these little streams are going to go into the unit. So I want to make sure that I go around the streams and see if there's more that's not mapped there. And so maybe I'd walk down this decommissioned road or this spur road, and I would go see the bottom border there and then zigzag my way up across the unit. So that's just something you want to think about when you start ground truthing and talk about with your ground truthing partners. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Sorry, I think it's a little slow. There we go.
Oh yeah. So this is the ground truthing form that we use. We'll go into a lot more detail on this on Saturday, but some of these items you're going to be filling out when you're ground truthing. Some of the things you kind of collect all the information and think about at the very end. Yeah. So we go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is an example of the of a unit map, and we will have paper maps available of the units, and we will also send you digital maps. Next slide. That you can download onto your phone if you have a smartphone and use this free app that we use called Avenza Maps. This allows you to open the map up in your smartphone and kind of use your smartphone like a GPS. You can track your path. So you can see over on the right, there's this orange line that shows everywhere that these ground truthers went. You can drop pins in like specific GPS locations about different things that you find, and you can attach photos to those pins. Yes, and then, yeah, so Gina, just to answer your question because it's relevant, so does BARC have access to the GPS points or a layer? Yes, so on this unit map, they usually have the GPS points attached to them. So that's one of the ways that we have access to that, but there's more we can talk about. Okay, next slide. So this is an example of a little bit of what we're going to be going over Saturday. We're going to get into what we are doing when we're ground truthing in the forest. And you can see in this right picture, we have somebody measuring a tree. So it looks like somebody's taking slopes, someone's measuring canopy closure. We're finding different animals. We'll talk about different animals and plants and what different types of forests look like.
Yeah. And I think that's most of what we had content-wise for tonight. It's this is kind of the more wonky half of the ground truth training where we kind of got to get all this stuff out of the way, all of the Forest Service process and navigation and whatnot. And so, yeah, like Misha said, Saturday I think we're going to get into what I guess most people anyway consider more of the fun stuff in terms of the talking about the ecology and the different plant and critters that we might be able to see out there that maybe are sensitive or protected, and yeah, just a little bit more about that whole process. And then like we mentioned at the top of the training, there's a lot of stuff that just due to the virtual nature of this training, it's just really hard to go over. It's a lot different than being out together out in the forest. And so if by the end of the second training, people are still feeling like a little bit shaky on stuff and maybe want to have a little bit more experience about, what people should be looking for, and want to go out with folks that are more experienced, that's we totally expect that. And so we're going to be setting up all of our field days in the early spring kind of with that in mind, and we'll have some time set aside so we can do some training out in the field, because that time in the forest is really the most important part of all of this. This is really something that most people really truly learn through doing it, and less through Misha and I talking to you about it. But that said, we definitely have some time right now I know we had, I think, some questions that we put on hold, and we also just kind of want to spend some time talking a little bit with all of you and seeing what kind of questions or concerns or topics anyone else wants to bring up.
All right, I'm going to get started with the first few questions, and then people want to chat or go on Stack. We can do that. So first question is, since NEPA doesn't require further studying, testing, studying, etc. after a project, does BARC continue to study areas after a project has happened?
Yes, we definitely do. So yeah, and for the first part of that, it's true, NEPA doesn't specifically require that, but the Forest Service does have requirements to do follow-up and quote unquote, adaptive management with all of their projects. And so there are other law, regulation, and policy components to what they do that do require them to do some monitoring. It's very little compared to what we believe they should be doing. And both in the scale and the detail in which they're doing those things. But yeah, the post-logging monitoring program that BARC started, I don't know, probably close to 10 years ago now, has really come up with a lot of issues that occur on the ground that the Forest Service, we found, doesn't, they don't really consider when they're planning these projects, and at the time weren't really following up on very much. When the timber companies did things that weren't included in the contracts that they had with the Forest Service. Up until recently, a lot of those things were just kind of overlooked. And so we've really seen that part of our work have a pretty big impact. And actually something that I do hope that we're going to be able to do early this summer is go up to some recently logged timber sales on the north side of Mount Hood to specifically look at some of those road impacts that happen. Because right now the Forest Service is saying that in future projects, they don't feel like it's necessary to disclose the locations or the number of miles of roads that they are likely going to be building into the forest as part of these projects. So I think it's going to be a really important thing to be able to get out and document some of the impacts that have occurred in places where they have built those roads, to kind of show that impact, and also show that in the past the Forest Service did disclose where those roads were going to be built, and because of that we're actually now able to go out and see what the effects were. So that's a pretty exciting post-logging project that we'll be doing this summer. Okay, and it looks like there's another question here about time of year or cadence to when the Forest Service typically schedules timber sales. So I guess if that question is in regard to like when the comment periods and kind of like the public input components of these timber sales are, they usually go pretty year round, although I would say that for the most part there's less of them in the summertime, because that's typically when the Forest Service employees are spending more time out in the woods, which is a good thing, laying out these timber sales and whatnot, doing kind of the field work that they do. So there's less office time for them, which means that very often we get more of these public comment periods during the off season when the forest is under snow.
Another question is the roadless rule. Is the roadless rule still in effect, and does it cover any part of Mount Hood?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the roadless rule, that's a policy, or it's a rule that was established on national forest that basically says that areas that are, I think it's 5,000 acres or more that don't have any roads in them, the Forest Service can't build additional roads into those areas. And there are areas in Mount Hood National Forest that are included in that. They're called inventoried roadless areas. And we don't oftentimes see timber sales proposed in those places, but there is a project right now that we're looking at called Grasshopper, which is where that first image in this presentation was taken, where we're going to be spending some time this summer, and it's out on the east side of Mount Hood, where there is some proposed logging and potentially quote unquote temporary road building proposed in those inventoried roadless areas. So yeah, for sure.
Are there habitat reserved for endangered species on Mount Hood? And maybe this is, I guess we can talk a little bit more about the different land allocations and reserves associated too.
Yeah, so that's something, let me go back to our data sheet here. This is actually a question that we ask, fill out if the information is available about the land allocation. And so again, the Forest Service has these different land allocations that the whole forest is broken up into. And I think about it sort of like, it's kind of like zoning in a way, where I wish we had a map. I don't think we do on this presentation that shows all the different land allocations where they exist. But each of these areas under these different land allocations, they all have what are called standards and guidelines that the Forest Service needs to be following when they're proposing activities there. And so some of them are very protective, and you could lump them under the category of reserves. And then other ones are very timber focused. And I will say that most of these land allocations, they were all mapped and established in the late 80s because the Mount Hood Forest Management Plan, I think it came out in 1990. And so that's just a caveat that these are based off of outdated information and science. And, I'm sure it was not a very inclusive process when they were laying these things out. But yeah, they each kind of have their own focus. And so there's another one that's actually under the Northwest Forest Plan called a late successional reserve. And that's one that, when we go back to this slide right here, this unit where this volunteer was standing in, where the Forest Service said that this was like, 30 years old or whatever, this was in a late successional reserve. And a late successional reserve under the Northwest Forest Plan, it says that there can only be forest management that happens in there if it benefits or accelerates late successional forest structure. So late successional is another word for, mature old growth, which we're going to talk a lot about on Saturday in terms of like what, structural components kind of define that. But this was an example where, because we went out and saw that this was an old growth stand, the Forest Service pulled this from the project because they couldn't actually justify doing anything in there anymore, because the stand was already late successional and really good habitat for late successional species like spotted owl. And so, that's kind of an example of how those sorts of things play out and why we asked that question on our data sheet. Sometimes you'll see areas on timber sale maps. Yeah, maybe we don't have one. But there was that question about habitat reserves. Yeah, I don't think we have a map that shows this, but northern spotted owl, that's a really good example of, that's a threatened species that when a nest of a spotted owl is located and known and documented, there are really clear standards and guidelines about the type of logging that can happen within proximity to that nest. And that goes for other species too. I think somebody mentioned red tree voles, and that's a species that in the North Clack timber sale, especially, that we were looking at a few years ago, we worked with a group that trained some of our volunteers on how to actually survey for red tree voles specifically, which involves actually getting up into the forest canopy, because that's a species that only exists in the canopies of old growth Douglas firs. It never touches the ground. And that's something that the Forest Service has historically done a really bad job of surveying for, because they don't get up into the trees. They just they look up from the ground and expect to be able to see something that can be the size of a human fist, basically, if that. So each one of those nests that were located, they received a 10-acre buffer. And so depending on the species, not all of them are going to have that huge of an impact on the type of logging that can happen as much as, say red tree voles or spotted owls. But that's also something we can talk more about on Saturday.
Yeah, and I don't remember if you mentioned this when you're talking about the land allocations, but some of the land allocations for Mount Hood are specifically about, or mention certain species. So there's one land allocation that talks about pine marten, and there's another few that specifically talk about like deer and elk range. So sometimes, yeah, that can play a part into the desired conditions of that area. Another question is, could the treatments be economical for the logging companies if they were to do what they say they are going to do? Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, what happens if Bark sends in comments that would or should alter the sale? How is the USFS legally obligated to respond?
Okay. Yeah, so that has happened before where, let's see, I'll go back to this crystal clear project. Sorry for all the rapid slide stuff. So yeah, depending on the project that we're looking at any given time, we always bring up issues that we feel like have legal merit, in that, you know, the Forest Service, according to NEPA or the Endangered Species Act or their own management plan, they really should be responding to these issues. So, you know, in regards to NEPA, again, if you think about the requirements of that, taking a hard look at what's out there and what the impacts might be, and making that transparent. So if we go out to the forest and we say, you know, we saw habitat for spotted owl, for example, which we found in this project, in the Crystal Clear project, that the Forest Service hadn't accounted for, you know, they're at that point, they're not complying with NEPA if they just ignore that. Part of it is that they are actually supposed to be, again, responding to the public input, and they can't, if there is information that's credible that is provided to them and they are ignoring it, that's a NEPA claim it could be a NEPA claim in a court of law. And that has been something that's been litigated on before, and groups like Bark have been successful. So like in this example, in the Crystal Clear project, we brought up that there was a ton of spotted owl habitat that the Forest Service wasn't acknowledging was there, and were proposing to log in. And on top of that, this entire area was under a land designation called critical habitat, which means it's habitat that the Forest Service is supposed to be prioritizing for the survival of northern spotted owls. And doesn't mean that they can't do logging there, but it means that where the habitat exists, they can't be doing things that remove that habitat or degrade it. And we brought up that there was much more habitat that was suitable for owls here than what they had disclosed. And that was one of the things that we took them to court on, and it, among other issues, resulted in them actually having to drop this entire 13,000 acre timber sale. So that's an example of like a very successful case that involves that. There's been other times, you know, like with the North Clack project, where there were some red tree voles nests that we did get the Forest Service to drop the logging surrounding, actually quite a few hundreds of acres, but there were other ones that they just kind of didn't, that they said that they didn't really need to take certain kinds of information that were provided in particular areas. And, you know, sometimes with groups like Bark, it's like, you know, you win some and you lose some. And there's times that we prioritize really pressing them on some of these legal issues, and other times that just because of capacity or other issues, it doesn't work out. But I don't know, hopefully those examples were helpful in regards to that question. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in there. Like I said, we got through kind of the wonky part, and I'm definitely ready to have some fun with, let's some of more of the ecology and critters and everything else on Saturday, and really looking forward to being out in the forest with you all this spring and summer. So thanks so much.